Do you as a Latter-day Saint filmmaker have a problem with the collaboration that can take place between Protestants and Latter-day Saints when it comes to storytelling?
Just the straight answer is absolutely not.
Hello and welcome to the Hello Saints podcast. My name is Jeff. I'm a pastor in Utah, exploring everything I can about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I am joined in this episode by my friend, Garrett Batty.
Jeff, thanks for having me.
Hey man, I'm so glad that you're here. So the reason why Garrett is here is because he and I met recently on a Go and Do Travel cruise, and we actually met in the lobby of the hotel.
That's right.
The morning that we embarked.
Yeah, we rode the bus over together.
That's right. And as soon as we started talking, I'm like, oh, this guy's a filmmaker. He's in my lane when it comes to production standpoint, and he was super cool and super intriguing. And I was like, we need to talk more.
Yeah, no, I felt the same way.
Yeah,
exactly. Like, oh, this guy's doing what I want to do, which is, telling stories, and it was very enjoyable to connect with you, and I'm glad we did.
Yeah,
stayed friends ever since.
And I mean, that's really kind of what it's all about when it comes to what we do. It's the storytelling, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's probably going to be the theme of our conversation. And the reason why Garrett and I decided to do this podcast episode together is because we recognize that storytelling is an important part of a faith context. It always has been. And, even though there might be the old timers out there that are like, oh, kids in their movies these days, or, just sitting around watching TV shows, the reality is storytelling is always central to the preservation and the posterity of any culture. And if you go all the way back into ancient times, I mean, the reason why we have the Pentateuch is because we had these oral traditions and stories that were being passed down. And finally, Moses was like, we need to write this down. We need to preserve the story that we believe God wants us to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and even Christ's teaching in parables are stories that resonate with the culture there, that are relatable.
Yeah.
But they become a memorable lesson.
Yes, absolutely. So that's why I admire what you're doing. And we're going to talk about a film that you're about to release, like pretty much right now at the release of this podcast, called Faith of Angels. Tell me about this film, Faith of Angels, and how it all came together and what the process has been, just from concept all the way to how it's sort of materialized.
Yeah. So I get approached at least weekly with different ideas.
Okay.
Like, hey, you're a movie maker. Here's an inspiring story, whatever. And they're all wonderful. I love that people want to share their stories. That's what we do, right? We want to tell stories, especially if they're a story that affects our soul or that helps us draw closer to Christ. Those are testimonies that they need to be shared. My job as a filmmaker is sometimes to determine whether or not those stories are for a theatrical audience or for a family reunion, right?
Which, by the way, I can relate to, because almost everybody I meet is like, hey, I've got this idea for a YouTube episode. And as well meaning as they are, and some of them are like very like cool ideas, you still have to consider, like, I think it's a cool idea. I would be interested in this, but is the broader audience going to be interested? So that can be a tricky thing.
And to say, do I want to spend the next 2 years of my life embedded in that story?
Yeah.
When the family of the boy approached me and said, here's a story that we think would be interesting, what caught my attention was that there was an angelic comforter mentioned with this boy. And it's reported on the news back in the time. Mm-hmm. Angels were felt. So it's okay, that caught my attention.
Yeah.
Then I start talking with the other individual who was involved in the rescue. And he says, I'm in the middle of Montana, and I wake up in the middle of the night, and there's this prompting or this angelic feeling. And I go, okay, there is something here that I think that should be a conversation in movie theaters.
Yeah.
And it's this miracle that exists, and kind of the behind the scenes nature of what it takes to pull that off.
Right.
And all of these angels working, together to make this happen.
Yeah. And to take this one story over here that made news headlines, but this other story that this individual in Montana was experiencing, and to weave those two things together to see how it makes this one super miraculous story is what makes it so compelling.
As a filmmaker, you go, that's my job, is to connect the dots and say, these people don't know that this was happening at the time.
Yeah.
But boy, if they do know that, it would help us see really the glory of God and the power of him being everywhere and omniscient, saying, we're going to make this happen. We're going to inspire people's faith.
Yeah.
So from that's where I said, okay, I'm going to stop what I'm doing. It's time to make this movie.
All right. So as to not just talk about it and show the poster, let's show people the trailer so they can get a taste of what this film's about.
Yeah.
Okay? Let's do it.
Dad, do you think we could go into the mine now?
And these mines are like a maze. You could turn around so quick in here. Can you imagine walking around in this with no light?
Can't even see the opening anymore.
Hello? Can anyone hear me?
It's been nearly 24 hours since 10-year-old Joshua Dennis was last seen.
Joshua!
Someone's gonna find him.
Why can't they hear me?
Why'd you come back so early?
I guess I just heard a voice.
Voice?
Sheriff, I think I can help. I have a crew in there right now. They handle this kind of thing.
If he's in there, we'll find him.
What is he doing in there? Is he cold? Is he hurt?
We'll investigate all scenarios that could have happened to the boy.
All scenarios.
The boy might be lost in there, or he could be hiding or injured. Maybe the boy just doesn't want to say anything.
Why would my son be hiding? It just doesn't make any sense. We've been through every possible place he could be.
I think it's time we just consider the inevitable.
Are you a man of faith, Sheriff?
You don't run something that's important on faith.
Hundreds of volunteers reached out through letters, prayers, and even showing up at the mine.
I spent my life crawling around through those tunnels, and I can't shake the feeling that I should be helping.
Take heart, my love, 'cause when I see you, I see hope. When I see hope. There's a world that needs what you got to give.
We have a missing boy. If he has even a sliver of hope, we better respond to it.
There it is. All right.
Story of hope.
Yeah.
You cannot watch this movie without just being filled with hope.
Yeah, absolutely. So go and check it out. It's going to be in Utah, September 12th.
Yep.
And it's going to be released nationwide September 26th.
The anniversary of the event happening.
The anniversary of the event. That's
it's
amazing.
pretty powerful. 35 years ago, this took place, and it was a national news story.
Yeah. And can people pre-order tickets?
Yes, tickets go on sale September 12th.
Okay. So link in the description for those who want to purchase tickets in advance. And this is going to be really cool to just watch it unfold and see how audiences receive it. So, all right, before we continue in this episode, I've been talking about a friend of mine named Lynn Spencer. He works with United Financial Freedom, and he is helping a lot of people shave down debt, loans, auto loans, mortgage loans, saving thousands of dollars in interest. He and I had a conversation where he actually demonstrates the program that is used with United Financial Freedom. It's called the Money Max account. And in the link of this episode, you can click on a free access demonstration of this program. And Lynn takes 30 to 40 minutes to not only talk about how the program works, but even gives an example of an actual case study of how it's helping somebody out. So check out the free demonstration in the link of this episode, and it will also give you all the information you need to directly get a hold of Lynn to see if this is a good solution for you. So check it out, United Financial Freedom, Money Max account, Lynn Spencer. Get a hold of him today. I don't think you'll regret it. One of the biggest things that people will suggest or recommend whenever I'm releasing Hello Saints videos is like, oh, you should watch this Latter-day Saint movie because it's about, story out of the Book of Mormon, or you should watch this one, which is a super campy, very nostalgic cultural thing about missionaries.
Yeah.
And I wasn't able to totally figure out how I can react to those. Until we started talking, I'm like, oh, Garrett can fill me in on this stuff, because we have that in the evangelical context,
which I didn't know about.
Oh my goodness, yeah. And again, I think this comes back to because intrinsically humanity, like we want to tell stories. We want to share stories that either preserve the heritage of our culture or help us understand how to assimilate and apply some of the core values of our culture. And sometimes those stories turn out great, and other times they're a little cringy. They don't necessarily stand the test of time. So I'm wanting to show you some of the evangelical stories that have been told on film through the years.
Okay.
And I'll
do the same.
to do the same from Latter-day Saint context, and we'll compare notes
The
here.
disclaimer has to be, right, that these films, I mean, we'll share the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yes.
Right?
Exactly. We're not here to poke fun.
Yeah.
But we're going to be honest if,
My name's on some of the ugly.
But thankfully, I've not released anything yet, so I don't have names on ugly evangelical films, but I can still be honest about my tribe. Okay, so let's start with just some of like the earlier films or TV shows in a Latter-day Saint context. Like, give me some examples of the ones that people will be like, oh, I remember back in the day when that was a thing.
Before I do that, a couple of disclaimers.
Yeah.
Because there's a couple of different things. There are the church-made content that is produced by the church, and these would be maybe like educational videos or spiritual messages that we all kind of watched growing up, and we go, oh, okay, we're playing this movie that was produced by the church where maybe entertainment value is secondary to message.
Yeah.
Okay. So those exist.
Yeah.
And those are out there. I don't know if we're going to jump into those. What I want to start with or show you when you say, oh, these are kind of the older movies that really made an impact. So we're talking like feature films that started to play in theaters. That's where I really became interested in telling faith-based stories.
Yeah. So these are films that played in theaters?
These are feature films that have been released in theaters and did well.
Like wide release or specific to like Utah and those areas?
Well, it started small, but then they get bigger and wider.
Okay.
And we'll cover some of these. The first of which is a movie called God's Army.
Okay.
God's Army is a movie about the Latter-day Saint missionary experience.
Okay.
And it was released in theaters and it was an independent film, but it did very well.
So when you say kind of older, that looked like it was in the 90s at some point, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think 2000 is when it came.
2001. Okay.
I mean, there are older, but
I'm sure.
not theatrically released independent films that like said, hey, we want to tell our own voice to a broad audience.
Yeah.
We want to tell our own story to a broad audience.
Yeah. And see, I was actually expecting, because the older evangelical films are ones that nowadays we kind of look back at and we chuckle at just a little bit. But this seemed like it was more of a substantive, like very heartfelt, faith-focused story.
Yes. Yeah, very earnest. I mean, and this was one where it opened up a lot of eyes for members of the Latter-day Saint Church to say, wow, somebody, like one of our own, is telling our story, rather than have, the guys from South Park do it or be misrepresented in pop culture. They said, hey, let's get out there and tell our own stories.
See, the scale that you're talking about, that balance of entertainment value versus sort of like a faith edifying message, is clearly seen in the clip that you showed here. And there are definitely, I would say from an evangelical standpoint, and we'll talk about this more in a second, that has become more the case of that more substantive faith edifying aspect, as opposed to, I feel like, in the earlier days of evangelical film, like some of the earliest ones that I remember watching as a kid were a little bit higher, I think, on that entertainment value. And I think that there was the intent to bring in some sort of biblical backdrop. But like growing up as a kid in the Midwest, and I think this was across most of evangelical churches, we would, especially on New Year's Eve, we would have something called watch night services. So instead of going to your neighbor's house and staying up till midnight or watching the ball drop, there would be church services. And while you're there, not only would there be maybe some singing and maybe a sermon, but then they would show movies. At least at the church I grew up with.
Churchy movies?
Churchy movies, yeah. And like one of them I remember was called A Distant Thunder. And I think I might have sent you the clip of it, but it was focused on the rapture. So when we're talking about watch night services, what it really became was this sort of this moment to sort of pause and to reflect not only on the year behind us, but the year to come. And are we aware of Christ's imminent return? And I think in one sense, that's a good thing. That's a good way to sort of commemorate the start of a new year. But the problem is this hyper focus on rapture, it became a fixation on apocalyptic gloom and doom, tribulation, and really when it comes to even that, like the movie I was just talking about, A Distant Thunder, that focus, it was, for me, it was really scary. Because it was...
How old?
I mean, we're going back into the mid to late 80s, so I was pretty young.
Okay.
I was between 5 and 7 years old. But it seemed so scary because it was all about like people disappearing and like planes crashing and like cars on the highway all of a sudden crashing, or like people not being able to find their parents or not being able to find their kids. And now I kind of laugh about it. But when I was a kid, I was like, is that really the best use of trying to like edify people through storytelling? And there's not that there's anything wrong with it, but I was actually talking to my dad about this. I was like, tell me about some of the movies that were in the 70s and the 80s. And he listed 3, and they were all 3 focused on some of those rapture story concepts.
Who would have produced or created the rapture movie?
Yeah.
Are these independent filmmakers, or is there a central church that is releasing content?
Great question. There's not a central church.
Okay.
So it was, I think, generally independent, just like Christian filmmakers or film companies. Some of them might have been produced by a larger, church.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm sure maybe the Catholic Church, Lutheran Church, they might have put out films, but I think these are more just independent filmmakers that were putting out Christian content.
Okay.
There might have been other films that were being made. I'm sure that there were. But as far as you were talking about theatrical releases, like in Utah or even broader, I don't remember these ever being in movie theaters.
Okay.
In fact, they were on like reel-to-reel projectors.
Okay.
That were shown in the church building. Yeah.
So those videos existed for us.
Okay.
Not. I don't recall any rapture-focused videos. That's but certainly how to help your neighbor, how to be a better person. And I could list off a movie called Cipher in the Snow or The Mailbox, and these are all 1980s created, maybe late 70s, 80s parables.
Okay.
Little 15-minute short films.
So they were shorter.
Yes.
They weren't necessarily feature length.
Correct.
Okay.
That I recall.
So then, that being the case, those are my earliest memories of the evangelical films. But there were ones that I remember liking as a kid that actually hold some like really strong nostalgic value for me.
Okay.
So what were some of the films that you remember, films or shows that were produced whenever you were growing up that you're like, yeah, this is sort of my childhood. Like I remember watching these as a kid. Yeah.
Like church films.
Yeah.
Well, there's a series called Living Scriptures, right? And these are animated films that told the story or specific stories in the Book of Mormon. So you might get a 30-minute VHS tape that's an animated scripture called Nephi and the Brass Plates, right? And you're watching, First Nephi chapter 3 through 4 of the story of Nephi returning to Jerusalem to, get the brass plates from Laban.
Yeah.
And they did a good job of narratively telling those scripture verses. Every kid, not only did they do a good job of making the movie, they did a good job of selling it. And it was one of these.
Yeah, I was going to say, where did you watch it? Because you didn't have YouTube. So
No.
Like
it was VHS tapes.
Okay.
And it was like a subscription model. Living Scriptures has just done a fantastic job of essentially saying, if you're a member of the church, you should own these tapes.
Okay. Strong business model.
Yeah, you couldn't go into somebody's home without them having the full set, 13 VHS series of Living Scriptures.
And they weren't that wasn't tied to the church organization. They just happened to be a Latter-day Saint nonprofit or maybe for-profit that was producing these films.
Correct. Yeah, I don't know the business model, but I would imagine they are for-profit.
Yeah.
And they were very well made. These are animators that had worked at Disney or had done, The Swan Princess or American Tail. So yeah, these are experienced animators, very talented at their craft.
Yeah.
But also want their own stories to be told, and so they create Living Scriptures. It's very well done, and yeah, I grew up watching those.
Yeah, that's amazing. As far as evangelical context, there was one series that we would watch as a kid that in hindsight is super weird and terrifying as I've watched it back. And it was called Salty the Songbook.
Okay.
But it was basically this Barney-like character that was a hymn book.
Oh.
And it's an 80s concept, okay? Like I can get on board with
no judgment. You're a safe space.
Hey, listen, Ghostbusters and Back to the Future came out of the 80s, okay? They were cool concepts, okay? So, but in this, as I look back on it, it's actually really scary looking because you have this person with this purple painted face and they're walking around like this songbook. And I don't even totally remember a lot of the stories, but it was all like church and faith and like little lessons and stuff. I remember watching that as a kid, what you would call primary, what we called children's church. But the higher quality one that I absolutely loved, I was obsessed with it. And anytime a Sunday school teacher walked in and they're like, hey, we're not going to do a lesson today, we're going to watch something, I was always like, please let it be McGee and me. McGee and me. Not salty.
Not salty.
Not salty. McGee and me. So this was a like pre-Veggie Tales, higher quality, episodic series of, it was live action, but it was in the time of like Who Framed Roger Rabbit. So what you have is this boy who is like living life, trying to make decisions as like a Christian and like, should he go to rated R movies or should he go to this party or should he go to this haunted house with his friends? And he was an artist. And as he would draw this little character, I believe his name was McGee, he would animate, come off the page and sort of be his guide like a Jiminy Cricket.
Yeah.
And so you're watching this boy maneuver through, adolescent life decisions with this Jiminy Cricket type of character who is kind of his companion and guide. And I loved that series.
So who is the intended audience for McGee and Me? Is it for saying, hey, this is for church audience, or we're not trying to sell this to TV stations or anything?
I don't think so. I mean, they might have. I know that there were other series that came after that, like Bible Man, which was a little bit past me, but it's a guy who's like a superhero that I think they tried to do on a broader distribution. And like VeggieTales, of course, like everybody knows VeggieTales. They pushed really hard to make that a broadly accessed, movies in theaters and VHS, and you could watch them on, different TV networks. But McGee and Me, I remember that was still in the time when I think it was mainly being distributed on like VHS and people would watch them. It really hasn't been until I would say 15 years ago that the evangelical world started to produce films that were being taken a little bit more seriously.
Yeah.
You had this one flare up in the late 90s, early 2000s of the Left Behind series with Kirk Cameron.
See, now I remember that when you talk about the Rapture movies or something like that. I remember Left Behind.
And the reason why that was so successful was because the books that came out before that were very successful. So you had Tim LaHaye, and you also had Dallas Jenkins. Speaking of him, his father, they co-wrote this Left Behind book series that was so successful. They were able to get the funding and a big name like Kirk Cameron to star in them. Now, at the time, evangelicals thought like, wow, we're making like Hollywood caliber films.
Sure.
As I look back on it, I struggle with it just mainly from the standpoint of, do those lower budget, faith based films hold up in quality and acting and storytelling, right? Because it's a notch down in quality. But even from a doctrinal standpoint, just the whole fixation on rapture is something that I personally probably have some church-going baggage on, because I felt like there was such a fixation on it that even it's doctrinally not even something that is widely held outside of the American 20th and 21st century church. If you go to England, if you go to Australia, they don't even really know what the rapture is. They know it's this sort of Americanized concept of Jesus returning and taking people up and all this other stuff. Now, we all believe that Jesus is coming back, but it's this whole idea of rapture where we're going to like disappear and then he's going to come back and reign and all that other stuff is a newer concept. But that's where I feel like the Christian, like the evangelical filmmaking has evolved really well over the past 15 years, because then they did start coming out with just more, let's move away from the rapture for a second and just tell stories of faith and testimony. And, God's Not Dead came out, which was a big one. Fireproof, which also had Kirk Cameron in it. But they were big, and I think they were released, theatrically. And made a pretty big impact. They were associated with books and devotionals and things of that nature.
Yeah.
So,
which I think that's been the that is the goal. That's a great goal. I mean, I think to reach a broader audience with our content. So we might say, hey, the Rapture movie, Left Behind, that spoke to its core, right?
Yeah.
Just like God's Army may have spoken to its core, or movies prior to that.
Sure.
And they exist within this Latter-day Saint sphere. But then the realization is, or I guess the pivot is, can we take these to a broader audience? Should we? And how do we? And maybe they're saying, hey, the Rapture, while it has spectacle and story that Hollywood might want, there are easier films to make.
There are other stories to tell.
Sure.
Which I'd be curious to hear what kind of stories have been told in more recent years in film. I know that you've actually been a part of some, and obviously the one that we're going to be talking about in a second with Faith of Angels. What does that storytelling look like today from an LDS context?
Yes. So there are kind of three little subgenres of Latter-day Saint film. Missionary movies. So with Latter-day Saint film, you've got movies like God's Army and The Best 2 Years, Other Side of Heaven, which was distributed by Disney.
Oh.
These are movies that continue to improve and do better and better and better. I made a movie called The Saratov Approach, which did well and played nationally. And so these are these missionary movies. Then there's certainly the Latter-day Saint culture comes from pioneers. And so there are pioneer stories that continue to be mined. There's a movie called 17 Miracles that, again, was kind of the first breakthrough pioneer movie that told our story the way that we want it told, and people responded very well to it. And then Ephraim's Rescue, and the list goes on of pioneer theme. I did one called Out of Liberty, which takes place, church history story in Liberty Jail.
It was a historic piece, a period piece?
Yeah, it tells the true story of the church leadership back in 1830 that's held in Liberty Jail.
Fascinating. I mean, I know the story. I didn't know that you made a film on that.
I did it as a Western and said, look, this is just an American Western story.
Of course.
And because of that, Samuel Goldwyn Films picked it up and they distributed it. And I get calls from people whose friends call them and say, hey, did you know somebody made a movie about your prophet? They're like, yeah. And Samuel, it's a Western. And so anyway, for me, that was a win because it's our story told for a broad audience that introduces people. And it's a very non-preachy film. Just here's a story that...
That's the thing that's so fascinating about the Latter-day Saint involvement in storytelling, because it feels so much more culturally interwoven and familiar in proximity to American culture and American history, as is storytelling, as is movie and film. I mean, that's very American as well. You have a story to tell that is more recent history. The establishment of the church, the history of the church, there are more recent stories tied to that. And you also have now this culture it's very unique with missionary culture. In the Protestant world, we're so broadly all over the map. We don't have this sort of localized ecosystem for storytelling, because how the broader Christian experience is lived out in England versus America versus Asia. It's so varied. Like, we all have different stories to tell. Yeah. So how do you then appeal to a broader audience then? And I think that's why evangelical films have taken off recently, because there's been, I think, a boom in the American evangelical community to want something. Like, there's a higher demand. Whereas in the Latter-day Saint context, that demand is just built in because you were already telling stories about the early church leaders and about the pioneers, and you all could relate to stories about serving on missions. So you've got it all right there.
You have an audience right there that kind of immediately can give you, tell you if your story is working or not.
Right, which is why I think God's Not Dead and Fireproof and some of those other films did well, because it seemed to resonate with an American evangelical experience, culture, lifestyle, all that other stuff. And where I feel like the evangelical world has excelled in more recent years has been in going back and telling the biblical, specifically New Testament stories. So you've got there was a movie that came out almost 10 years ago called Risen, and we were texting back and forth about it.
I love Risen.
It's so good. It's about a Roman soldier. It's historic fiction, but based on the resurrection of Christ. What if a Roman soldier who is assigned to investigate the missing body of Jesus enters into that story? And I thought it was amazing.
It's very well done. It was directed by a very experienced director, Ken Reynolds.
Had one of the Fiennes brothers in it, Ralph Fiennes.
Yep.
So there was that caliber of acting in it.
It was solid, very well done. In fact, I shot a movie in Romania, and my script supervisor was the script supervisor of The Chosen. Of
Risen.
Risen.
Yeah.
And so she shared me like location shots and told me stories about that. And as a movie fan, that was a very memorable experience.
Yeah, and there's definitely, we have an audience for that, because in the evangelical world, if there's one thing that we do uniformly do, is we're always in the scriptures. We're studying the scriptures. And it's like a light bulb went on recently to be like, oh, if we tell the story of Noah, or if we tell the story of the resurrection of Jesus, or Dallas Jenkins, if we try to do a good job at really a high caliber storytelling of the Gospels with The Chosen, there's going to be an audience here for it, because we're all in the scriptures. And that's what I feel like we've finally figured out in the evangelical world.
And I think that's the goal of Latter-day Saint film, from makers, is say, how do we get to a broader audience? And I recently did a movie called The Carpenter. It's coming out in November.
Okay.
And played it at Christian film festivals. And it was such an eye-opening experience to go around to Christian film festivals and to discover that those that are creating The Chosen or Risen or independent evangelical films are asking the same question. And it was validating to say, oh, okay, nobody yet knows how to reach a broader audience except for tell a good story.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we've seen with Risen and The Chosen and everything.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter if it's an evangelical that's creating it, or a Latter-day Saint, or a combination of Daryl Eves and Dallas Jenkins.
Right.
It's a good story.
It's a good story.
And that's how it resonates to a broad audience, even beyond deeply religious people.
Yeah. So pivoting with that then, let's talk a little bit how our respective contexts have been receiving this newer wave of even collaboration between evangelicals and Latter-day Saints. Because do you, as a Latter-day Saint filmmaker, have a problem with collaborating, or the collaboration that can take place between Protestants and Latter-day Saints when it comes to storytelling?
Just the straight answer is absolutely not. No, like that to me is where we need to get to.
Why do you feel that?
I think, if I had to have an answer right now, it would be because the creative process brings people together, right? That is the nature of creation. And when I went to South Africa to location scout, and they said, they heard a little bit about the movie. They said, great, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Salt Lake City, Utah. And they immediately kind of like, said, well, okay, come down anyways, and we'll see if it works out. They were very protected and very cautious about moving forward with a Latter-day Saint for this faith-based movie. Yeah, we went down, we shared the script, we ended up making the film down there, and by the end of the movie, we had created something together about the life of that was a story of Christ, and the process put differences aside and just celebrated what we have in common. And so that's a long answer to your question, but I would much rather work with creative storytellers that want to get together and share and create this story of Christ, rather than saying we don't believe everything
the same way,
therefore I'm not going to work with you.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting phenomenon that has unfolded. Specifically, we see it with The Chosen. I mean, Dallas Jenkins has taken a lot of shots, and he's been under a lot of heat from the broader evangelical community, not just with the collaboration with Latter-day Saints to produce it, because some of it's shot here in Utah. Obviously, Daryl Eves, who's a Latter-day Saint, helped with all the crowdfunding. I mean, he was the mastermind behind the crowdfunding for it. But then, since there's a contingent of the evangelicals that they don't really want to have anything to do with Latter-day Saints, then they start to scrutinize even the scripts.
Sure.
It's like, are you saying this? Is this a Latter-day Saint influence? And on one hand, I can appreciate the desire to be discerning about who we collaborate with and all that. on the other hand, it almost became a gatekeeping measure that had, Dallas conceded and backed down or whatever. I think it would have caused a lot of confusion and a lot of chaos, and actually taken away from the opportunity to tell this now very beautiful presentation of Christ and the Gospels that's impacting millions of people.
It's amazing. I think Dallas has just done a phenomenal job of navigating that
tension.
That tension.
Yeah,
that's well put. When you started making Faith of Angels, it was with that intention to say, let's go beyond a Latter-day Saint film, and let's say, what is this movie about? What is this story about? Why did this story at the time resonate with a nationwide audience? Where the President of the United States is commenting on this story, and let's look into that.
Yeah.
We then cast the movie with that in mind, and so our cast is John Michael Finley from I Can Only Imagine, which is a huge Christian faith-promoting story.
Yeah.
And then we cast Cameron Arnett, who's from the Kendrick Brothers movies, and he's in the movie called The Forge that's coming out in August. A iconic faith-based actor. And said, if this story can resonate with them, and if they'll collaborate with us, then I think that's how we, like Dallas with The Chosen, that's how we tell these stories and really make an impact.
Yeah. So to that point, let's talk a little bit more about Faith of Angels. So what has the process been like when it comes to like the idea you had for the movie, what the production processes look like, and sort of where you're at with it now?
So again, the story is about it's a true story about a young boy that goes missing in an abandoned mine, and hundreds of miles away, a stranger completely unrelated to this boy or story or anything gets this prompting, this spiritual angelic guidance to say, drive to Utah. He doesn't even know why at the time. Drive to Utah. When he shows up, he learns of the peril of this boy. It just so happens that he used to play in this mine as a child and knows it, just every nook and cranny of it, and feels compelled like he is the one that is supposed to help find the boy. And the movie details that story. The opposition is that he can't get in. He's not a professional search and rescue. You don't find people on hunches and instincts. You find them through a methodical way of, searching.
Yeah.
And that was not what
the authorities weren't kind to that idea.
Yes. And so day after day after day of looking for this boy unsuccessfully, and of our hero trying to get into the mine unsuccessfully, hope starts to dwindle. So then you'll have to watch the movie to figure out what happens.
Yeah. But as I was watching it, I didn't know this story even existed. It's a true story. I didn't even know that it happened. But I was having flashbacks of like the baby Jessica story that like had a deep impact on me whenever I was a kid.
Yeah.
Because in the 80s, you have this little girl who fell down this pipe, and then there was this race to try to get her out. But it was the same type of thing as I'm watching Faith of Angels. It's like, man, this is getting serious. And knowing that this wasn't just about, getting to the mine and finding the kid, but you did have this prompting, this spiritual motivation by one of the individuals who was trying to help out, made it a super compelling story. Joy and I were able to watch it when we were on the cruise because you screened it there.
Yeah.
And man, I remember we showed up, it was after we had been out all day on an excursion, and we were like super tired, and I'm like, I'm really tired. And if there's anything that will put me to sleep, even if it's the best movie in the world, if it's after 10:30, I start watching a movie. It could be...
That'll knock you out.
Yeah, it could be Saving Private Ryan, and I'm still probably going to go to sleep, right?
Yeah.
But I was glued to it, and I was like dialed in, and Joy and I both are like, man, that was a really powerful story, and you did an amazing job with it.
Thank you. I'm thrilled with how it's come together, and the story exists, and I see it as right now it's in my stewardship, and I've got to try to get it to the next people that are going to take it over, and that's the audience.
Yeah. So to be clear, Latter-day Saint filmmaker, is this a Latter-day Saint film, or help me understand the faith aspect of Faith of Angels?
Yes. And to counter that, to be clear, I am a filmmaker and a Latter-day Saint,
right?
But not a Latter-day Saint filmmaker.
Okay, love it.
So any of my stories, just like Out of Liberty, which tells the story of Joseph Smith in Liberty Jail, but Samuel Goldwyn distributes it as a Western. Mm-hmm. This film is a faith-based movie on the same level of Ordinary Angels or Unsung Heroes, or His Only Son. Yeah, and we're seeing it now resonate with audiences that weren't even familiar with the story.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's tell people how they can get a sneak peek of it or eventually go and see it.
So right now, I mean, it opens up September 12th in Utah because that's where the story took place, not because of the nature of the faith in Utah. And then, but we're doing group screenings right now until it opens nationwide. So anybody outside of Utah can say, we'd like to see this movie with our church group or whatever it is.
Yeah.
You know, Cameron Arnett has people in Atlanta that are booking the movie.
Awesome.
And so they can go to the website, faith-of-angels.com.
Awesome.
And book the group tickets.
Yeah. And for my audience, which I know is primarily Latter-day Saint, I'm sure now that you know about it, like, you're going to want to go and see this film because it's great. But beyond that, to your point, like, even all of my evangelical friends, you know, people of faith, it's a super wholesome, compelling story. And again, you did an amazing job telling the story. So we need to get as many people out there as possible to go and check it out.
I think that's what I think. The more people that go see it, it's just like The Chosen, you know, the more these types of movies get made.
Yeah.
And these types of collaborations can happen.
Yeah. Hey man, I really appreciate you hanging out with me and talking about this stuff. It's super cool.
I'm such a super fan of what you're doing. And honestly, I've been just watching every episode and I'm thrilled to be here.
Thanks, man. Really appreciate it. So check out Faith of Angels. Obviously, there's other films that he's working on that's coming out. The Carpenter is one.
November 1st.
November 1st. Okay, keep an eye out for that. And in the meantime, while you wait for those films to come out, just watch some Hello Saints videos. And if you're behind, you can start binging through them. So like this video, subscribe. If you're listening on a podcasting platform, obviously follow. And you can get every podcast episode as they pop up. And you can also support me on Patreon if you'd like. If you don't want to, you don't have to. Just keep coming back for more videos, more podcast episodes like this. And until next time, we'll see you later, Saints.